Hello friends, for today's video I wanted to go through a list of stories that if you like Brandon Sanderson's works, there's a chance you'll like these as well. I do think that part of the challenge in doing a direct like this try that style of video for Sanderson's catalog is that he's just written so many different things, and people come to his works for different reasons. For some it's the magic systems, others it's the characters, the themes, the mental health representation. So whatever reason there is that people are gravitating towards Sanderson's works, it can vary from one person to the next. And as a result, I wanted to structure this where I acknowledge the stories that, generally speaking, get recommended a lot for if you like Sanderson, and then I wanted to dive into some that are a little bit more specific and a little bit more one-to-one, where if you like this specific story by him, you might like this other work. And then at the end, I wanted to just kind of go through a couple that I think that there's a chance of some overlap. But with all that said, we'll start by just acknowledging the ones that I think I'd be remiss to not mention, and those would include Lightbringer, Wheel of Time, and Powder Mage. I'll go ahead and kick things off with Wheel of Time, as this was somewhat of the catalyst for Sanderson's big boom in his career. It was one of the pieces that contributed to his career taking off. A lot of people, I think, are now coming to Sanderson through two series, which would be Mistborn and Stormlight Archive, which might not be necessarily the exact way in which you came to him, but I would say those are two of his biggest series. Mistborn probably being the most easily accessible for adult fantasy fans, and then for people wanting to take the plunge, then they go for Stormlight. I don't really think there's too many parallels between Mistborn and Wheel of Time, but I do think that some inspiration can be seen between Wheel of Time and Stormlight Archive. The differences lie in very much how they approach their characters. I definitely think that Sanderson spends so much more time developing the characters, why they are the way they are, their patterns of behavior, and their mental health. Whereas in Wheel of Time, you don't quite see that to the same extent. However, it's in the world building and the ever-expanding lore and discoveries, and also the almost hierarchy of levels of villains and gray morality, where you can see if you like one, you might like the other. So while a lot of people definitely note that Stormlight Archive's mental health representation is one of the things that they adore about the series, if you more so love the epic scale and scope of Stormlight Archive, then Wheel of Time is an obvious transition. As for Lightbringer and Powder Mage, I have picked up the first books in both of these series, and I personally don't think that the plot lines or the characters themselves or the tones are necessarily that similar. The thing that I think is notable about these two in particular would be their magic systems. They are a lot more leaning on the hard side of a magic system, and obviously I think the whole concept of a magic system is somewhat in part due to how much people came to crave that after reading Sanderson's works. For so long, the magic in fantasy stories was more so something that felt abstract, and it felt like this thing tied to the ether or something that couldn't really be defined. And so he approached it more so, as many of you know, by having this mindset of, okay, well, there would be rules and limitations. It would be almost like a science. And as a result, I do think we've seen a lot more of, one, a boom in magic systems in fantasy, but specifically readers wanting more of the rules and limitations within their magic systems. And I do think that both Lightbringer and Powder Mage fulfill that. If it's the magic systems you love about Sanderson's works, especially with Mistborn, with how specific things can be, I do think that there will be a chance you'll like these as well. Second era Mistborn in particular, I think has more overlap with Powder Mage due to the kind of weaponry that you see in both of these series. Lightbringer, I do think there's somewhat of a Mistborn because of the extent of the rules and limitations, but a little bit also, I would say, Warbreaker due to the way in which color plays such a large role in the magic systems themselves. Speaking of magic systems, I promise that won't be something I say over and over and over again throughout this video. We're primarily just gonna lock it into this next recommendation, which would be Foundry Side. And this is where I'm transitioning into doing a little bit more of a one-to-one. If you like this, try that. Foundry Side is a story where the idea is that you can somewhat change the motivations of objects, or you can at least warp their reality to believe that what is surrounding them is different. So for an example, something that happens very early on is that if there is a wheel moving on a cart, you convince it that there is wind blowing and thus it is turning a certain way, and then the cart will move that direction. And then you can have the reverse happen. You can tell it the wind is moving the other way, and then it will go that direction. So thus, the reality is warped and it responds as such. And I thought that this magic system felt so interesting and unique and very scientific in a sense, but I actually found that once I read Emperor's Soul by Sanderson, which is one of his lesser known works, but once I read Emperor's Soul, I thought, okay, I actually feel like there's a little bit more of a crossover appeal between these two than I would have expected. So Emperor's Soul in a lot of ways feels like so many of Sanderson's magic systems all tied into one. And in this story in particular, you're following somebody who is a forger, and they have the ability to essentially look into the entire history of an object. And in the plot, you're seeing this particular character is someone who they are now trying to almost make a replica of a human being, and they have to try and understand all of the history. There's so much to it. Really, I think it's one of his most creative and interesting magic systems. However, chances are, if you're coming to this video, you're aware of Emperor's Soul and its magic system. You don't need a further elaboration. But Foundry Side, if you liked the way in which Emperor's Soul magic system played out, then there's a chance that you'll like the magic system in Foundry Side as well. Moving out of magic systems as a tie and changing to something a little bit different, the next recommendation I'm going to give would be Race the Sands. This is a standalone fantasy story that when it first starts out, you're kind of thinking like, oh, okay, this is well contained, and then it gets so much bigger than you could have anticipated just based off of, one, the premise, and two, when you first start the story. It's like the further you go, the more of a snowball effect there is, and it just keeps getting bigger and bigger, but in a very well done fashion. And the setup is that you follow this woman who has a daughter, and she loves her daughter dearly. She does everything she can to provide for her, and this entails her taking on jobs that honestly she doesn't love, but she'll do it anyway because she'll do anything for her child. And the particular job she has currently is basically being a coach to children who want to race. In their world, there are these races with these beings known as Keyhawks, and Keyhawks are resurrected people, but the most awful people in society. So the idea is Keyhawks are among the lowest of the low of all kinds of life, and people will race these, and it's pretty much a death sentence. If you choose to race these, there is a high likelihood that you will not make it or that you will be severely injured. And our main character is somebody who used to race, and now she is teaching other people about the race. She doesn't really love this job, but she'll do what she's got to do. Things end up taking a turn, and now she's suddenly finding herself absolutely desperate, not just to train people about races, but to put a person in a race and be their coach, which I definitely, when I heard the synopsis, was like, I mean, okay. I didn't think that sounded like much. And on top of all of that, given the idea of this video, you might be like, how does that relate even a little bit to any of Sanderson's books? The book that I think ties to this a little bit would be Warbreaker. First off, there is the idea of how resurrection plays a part in society, as in Warbreaker, you are seeing resurrected beings as some of your perspectives, well, one perspective in particular, but also they do make up part of society, and how people look at society is dependent on where they're from, how much they have a part in the magic. And there are a lot of religious figures who are kind of behind the scenes, and you're wondering, who can I trust? There's a lot of intrigue. And even though Race the Sands starts out as sort of a mentor-mentee story at its core, it transforms into something that has a lot more political implications and intrigue. And I just think that there's something about the tone of the both of them where there's something kind of fun. You get more and more perspectives as you build, and there's also certain perspectives where you're like, okay, I think I can picture how this is going to come together, and I think I'm understanding the implications of this. And then you just kind of have to keep reading to find out. And again, I know it doesn't sound like it's that similar, but really I think if you like Warbreaker and you like its tone, and you like the way in which the way in which society views how their magic works differently depending on who they are and where they come from, I think there's a chance that you'll enjoy Race the Sands as well. The next recommendation will be for one of Sanderson's non-Cosmere works, which would be Skyward. If I'm not mistaken, I believe this is his most successful non-Cosmere story, and with good reason. I think there's a lot to this that is really captivating, gripping, fast-paced, and in a lot of ways this is like a sci-fi take on the A Boy and His Dragon story, except for instead of having a boy and his dragon, you have a girl and her spaceship. And if you you really love that component and you like the idea of there being camaraderie and this bond between a human and something non-human, I think there's a good chance that Ascendant will appeal to you. This is the classic A Boy and His Dragon setup. You follow this young man who is not necessarily of the most important role within society. He is a cook, and through some things that occur early on in the story, he finds himself in possession of a dragon egg, which should never happen, especially because there are a lot of things in place for how people can become dragon riders, who can become a dragon rider, and what the dragon riders do. So when he finds himself taking care of this egg, he starts to realize, oh my gosh, when this hatches, I'm gonna have to take care of a dragon. And then it does hatch, and he does start having to take care of a dragon, and his whole world gets flipped upside down. But also, within Skyward, you do see that there is a constant threat from what would seem to be this alien force. And then in Ascendant, there is this constant threat from what seems to be this gross bug-like force, we'll say. And so you do see that there are so many things beyond just the more interpersonal dynamics in the story, but also there are these greater threats, and you don't really know all of the details, but you learn more about those as you progress through the series. I do think that one of them is very much more obviously fantasy, and one of them is obviously very sci-fi, but I do think there's a lot of parallels that if you like one, you'll likely enjoy the other as well. Returning to the Cosmere though, we have Yumi and the Nightmare Painter, and no one is probably surprised. You all know that I love Final Fantasy X. It's not a book, but it doesn't matter because it was a clear inspiration for Yumi and the Nightmare Painter. And if you liked Yumi, then check out Final Fantasy X. Also, just check out Final Fantasy X. It's so good. I love it so much. I still love it to this day, no matter how many new games I play. I feel I always come back to Final Fantasy X. I always want to replay it, and I kind of find myself relating my feelings for video games in comparison to how I feel about Final Fantasy X. So, you know, if I'm playing the newest Final Fantasy, I'm like, but is it as good as 10? Or if I'm playing Elden Ring, which is a totally different game, I'm just like, but is it as good as Final Fantasy X? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what medium the story comes in. It doesn't matter if it's new or old. I love Final Fantasy X, and I have for years. And Sanderson himself is a big fan of Final Fantasy X. So as somebody who is obsessed with that game, when I picked up Yumi and the Nightmare Painter, I did immediately start to pick up on some of the inspirations. I do really respect that the inspirations are more so nods to Final Fantasy X as opposed to there being direct plots that are pulled from that story or the exact characters. He certainly has a unique spin on this inspiration and these nods, so I was really appreciative of that. However, there are so many things to love about both. One in particular is the way in which the society is sort of an interesting blend of both incredibly futuristic, but also there being this thing that feels less advanced. So in Yumi and the Nightmare Painter, you have two main characters. One of them comes from this more sci-fi futuristic fantasy world, and then the other seems to be living in a completely different time period that has not progressed to the same degree. And in Final Fantasy X, you see something very similar with your main character. He is somebody who is living in this very futuristic society. He also has a job in this society, and that was one of the things Sanderson noted that he appreciated about Final Fantasy X is the way in which, okay, if there was this fantasy world, what kinds of jobs would people have, and what would be like everyday life for these people? And both Yumi and Final Fantasy X have that with their protagonists, but then both of these individuals suddenly find themselves experiencing the other main character's world, and this world in Final Fantasy X also seems less advanced. A difference between the two is that throughout Yumi and the Nightmare Painter, these two characters do kind of bounce back and forth between each other's, whereas in Final Fantasy X, our main protagonist is kind of like, I don't know how to get back. And that's a big reason why he's like, I guess I'll just follow these people around. I don't really know what to do. You do see tremendous character growth for the characters throughout these stories. There is certainly an element of young love with these characters, and also the world building is absolutely fascinating. It's all so great. It's wonderful. There's a lot of other inspirations, but I can't really talk about some of them without getting into spoiler territory, but just know they're there. Final Fantasy X is so good. And it's on like every platform now, you know? You can play it on PlayStation 5, you can play it on the Switch, you can play it on the computer, you can play it in so many different ways. You all have no excuse. I'm just kidding. You don't have to play it if you don't think it sounds that good. The next recommendation I'm going to give is also a video game. I'm just going to kind of throw this out there pretty quickly, and that would be Tales of Arise. This one is more so just in its setup. It has some connections to how things are set up within Stormlight Archive. So you do see in Stormlight Archive, of course, there's the light eyes and the dark eyes. And there are people that are treated as basically less than human and that are very much looked down upon, and they are relegated to certain tasks or roles within society. And you do see something very similar in Tales of Arise. I think the stories certainly go into their own territory, but if you are somebody who is open to checking out video games, Tales of Arise is a lot of fun. Plus, the art style is really interesting, and I do think that it's just a fun adventure. I think it's less serious than Stormlight Archive, certainly, but I do think that those world-building details are very notable. And then for the last few recommendations, these ones are just sort of generally speaking. I don't think there's necessarily a specific element to these where it's obvious, oh yeah, if you like this, you'll like this as well. The first one would be Strange the Dreamer. I definitely think Laini Taylor has a much, much more poetic way of writing, I'll say, than Sanderson. Sanderson, if anything, is actually known for being a little more straightforward and every now and then leaning into some philosophical musings, but the writing itself tends to be a little bit more upfront because he's more so focused on the story, the plot, the characters, the worlds, all those details. Laini Taylor's like, what if I was exceptionally creative? And then also, I wrote exceptionally purple. But I really do love her writing. It is very flowery, but as somebody who is kind of picky about flowery writing, in her case, I definitely think it works. She just has such a command, not necessarily on just the language, but also imagery. She just seems to capture color and metaphor in a way that is really beautiful. The creativity in both of these authors is where I'm drawing the comparisons. I definitely think that when you pick up either of these authors, I personally never feel when I pick up Laini Taylor like I'm picking up something like anybody else. I'm always like, this is Laini Taylor. It's out there, it's weird, it's creative, it's unlike anything else. And I feel that way about Sanderson's works. There's just something about them that, while there are certainly pieces of his works that are inspired by other things, and then also there, I think, have been a lot of inspirations taken from his works, while all that's true, they still exist very much on their own. And I just think that that level of creativity is hard to match, and I think Laini Taylor and Sanderson both excel in this area. And then last, we have a manga/anime that I've been absolutely loving making my way through, but also I'm really scared to keep going because I'm almost done and I'm nervous, but that would be Attack on Titan. Attack on Titan is absolutely brutal. It has incredibly high stakes, but the thing that I am comparing is the fact that Attack on Titan, when it first begins, you're getting your feet on the ground, you're trying to figure out what's going on, and then the rug gets pulled out from under you time and time and time again, but in the best of ways. And then when you start getting reveals, you're like, wait a sec, that was there the whole time. Are you kidding me? And I haven't had too many other stories do that to me aside from Sanderson. Sanderson is so good at the rereadability factor. I think most of us, if we've read Mistborn, which I imagine a lot of you watching this have, you know there are certain things you're like, wait a sec. When you get to certain moments, you're like, that has to mean that that thing happened back then. And then you go and you flip through and you check and you're like, gosh darn it, it did. And it was there right in front of my face this whole time. And you get so just, it's an experience. We all know, we've experienced it before, or at least I hope you have, where you're blown away and you're like, you gotta be kidding me. And then you go back and look. And I definitely think Attack on Titan has that. And it's just a blast. It's so fun, even though the stories are, Attack on Titan is very different from a lot of Sanderson's works. I still think, though, that feeling, along with having incredibly high stakes, which a lot of his books do, I think those parallels are certainly present. But anyway, that's it for some. If you like Sanderson's works, maybe try these out. Of course, feel free to leave your own recommendations, as I think anybody coming to this video, it would be really helpful to not just see the things that I've said, but also to be able to look in the comments and see your recommendations as well. Also, if you like this style of video, I did the same thing for Robin Hobb. So I'll have that linked if you're interested, and then let me know if you're interested in seeing more videos like this. I'd be happy to do them. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.